Due Process, for the second consecutive year, recipient of Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards for Outstanding Talk Show Series and Outstanding Public Affairs Series.
In terms of the law in this country, animals are considered property. And that's a very critical distinction because they are not people.
We believe that animal liberation is human liberation, and that we believe that animals exist for their own reasons, their own purposes, and that they don't exist for us.
Animals, property to be disposed of as we please, or creatures with rights to be respected. Up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the Legislative Manual.
Can you guess which victims inspire the greatest sympathy in the justice system? I'm Raymond Brown, and if you said animals, you might just be right. People are always concerned with protecting children, and we are all increasingly aware of the danger of violence towards women. But in more than 2 decades as a trial lawyer and legal journalist, I've seen judges, juries, and casual observers become outraged when the rights of animals seem violated or ignored. Of course, there's controversy as to just what those rights are, as we see in this Due Process report. On the surface, Duke seems like a pretty good all-around family dog. Who would guess that not only is he a perp, but he's the basis for a recent groundbreaking legal decision?
Pepper was playing out on the yard, and the neighbor's pit, or I guess it's American Bulldog, was let loose and came running up the lawn and attacked Pepper. I ran out of the house, and the dog finally let Pepper go, and Pepper was very injured.
The incident cost Heather Hyland over $2,000 in veterinary fees, but Pepper survived. The problem arose when the Hylands went across the street to their neighbors to try to collect.
They said they were a little nervous about that, and they would have to call their insurance.
After that, the neighbors, Greg and Donna Boris, stopped returning the Hylands' calls. After 4 months of getting nowhere, Heather went to John McDermott for help.
Heather came to me and asked if I would file suit for her to recover the damages that she sustained as a result of the injuries to the dog.
The suit was filed in the special civil part of the Superior Court in Sussex County. The homeowner's insurance company argued that the damages should be limited to the replacement value of the dog, $500. Animals, they reasoned, are personal property, and in this case, repair costs outweighed the replacement price.
The trial court ruled that she was entitled to $2,500. And then on the appeal, the appellate division also agreed and sustained Judge Harper's original decision.
What makes this seemingly innocuous case important is the change in the status of pets. Judge Eichen, writing for the appellate division, wrote that we view defendants' approach to measuring damages in this case to be overly mechanistic. A household pet is not like other fungible or disposable property, intended solely to be used and replaced after it has outlived its usefulness. It was a decision that made animal rights activists prick up their ears. Ann Cremato is with the New Jersey Animal Rights Alliance.
That's definitely a landmark decision, a step in the right direction towards recognizing animals as having value other than as property.
Animals as property have little legal protection. They have no rights other than to be treated humanely. As a society, we are grappling with almost every aspect of how we interact with other species.
Was This is wrong. There should not be hunting within the limit.
One of the goals of some animal rights organizations is to recognize that animals should be thought of as persons under the law. A case like Highland versus Boris is important in that it takes animals a step away from being property. It is a legal strategy that threatens those who use animals in any way, particularly those in biomedical research.
If animals are not property, then they are entitled as people to have rights. And what happens? Think about the implications of that.
Jane Makta is executive director of the New Jersey Association for Biomedical Research.
Animals play a very significant but small part in the entire research process. And because science doesn't have all the answers, you need a living system to test out both why things are working, and then when you think you've got an answer, you've got to test it out.
The fact that chimpanzees are our closest living relatives did not save him from living death.
What troubles most Americans, however, is the morality of many kinds of research involving animals. Groups like People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals capitalize on footage like this to sway public opinion. Biomedical researchers, however, insist that animals make up just a small part of their protocol and that 90% of those are rodents.
Every medical breakthrough has benefited from the role of animals in the process. The development of pacemakers, understanding what cancer is.
And there are many others who will testify that they owe their lives to the use of animals in research.
Transplantation 50 years ago was unknown, and it wasn't until about 30 years ago that New Jersey began advancing the techniques of transplantation. So, of course, that was done with the use of animals.
Those who advocate for animals argue just as strongly against their use.
Animals are not the same as people. They have different circulatory systems, they have different immune responses, and this is a statistic that really surprised me when I heard it, but when you perform an experiment on a rat, you cannot get the same results on a mouse almost 50% of the time.
Granting rights to animals is a long way away. Meanwhile, we are a society that seems to be at odds with itself. Millions of animals are bred for our dinner plates, and millions more are dumped into shelters with little hope of adoption. Animals are hunted, kept for our entertainment, and subjected to all manner of experimentation. And yet we strive to be a compassionate culture. The numbers of animals used in research has fallen dramatically, and the number of vegetarians has risen just as dramatically. Still, negotiating peace on the issue of animal rights is difficult.
Gandhi said once that the moral progress of a nation can be judged by the way that it treats its animals, and we believe that very firmly.
It might seem strange to quote Gandhi, a great champion of human rights, while speaking of animals, but that reflects how deeply people think and feel about them. Of course, there are widely differing views about how animals can be treated as pets, as sources of food and clothing, or as subjects for scientific experimentation. Consequently, the law in this area is constantly changing, so Due Process recruited a group of experts to bring us up to speed on the subject. You'll meet them right after this.
Anti-hunter. I don't believe that animals should be tested for any kind of diseases, chemicals. I think it's horrible.
I have a 17-year-old son who's an animal advocate, and I firmly believe in his beliefs. But my father was a furrier for 35 years, so we have a controversy on both ends.
I used to hunt, but I hunted for food. I don't hunt for fur.
Animals should have rights, not necessarily the same as we have. However, the abuse, the killing of animals for fur coats or things of that nature is very wrong.
Should we eat animals? Should we subject them to experiments we wouldn't perform on humans? How much is your pet worth if injured? To explore these and related questions, joining us from Newark is Diana Jeffrey, an attorney and director of the Animal Rights Welfare Federation of New Jersey, and in Trenton, Alan L. Krause, a doctor of veterinary medicine and board certified by the American College of Laboratory Animals. He's lectured and thought deeply about the ethics of animal experimentation. And Paula Francisi, professor of law at Seton Hall Law School, a former trial lawyer who has a special interest in whether animals are property or have rights. Paula, let me start with you. It seems as though things have changed. My impression is that 30 years ago, I could turn my dog into a circus act. I could maybe arrange to eat him or wear him, and certainly could sell him to a lab for experiments that might be pretty cruel without much danger of either legal or social attack. Has there been a change, and if so, what's the direction of the change?
Well, there certainly has been a significant change. Thankfully, Raymond, it's taken centuries for it to evolve. This notion of animals as property is such an ancient, arcane notion. It dates back to the early Romans, who believed that the planet was created for the benefit of man. Not woman, mind you, but for man. Since men possessed the ability to reason, the logic went, they were allowed to tyrannize nature, including, obviously, animals. The English common law followed suit. So, for example, in my property classes, we begin each year with the so-called rule of capture. That tells us that still in this country, one is able to acquire an ownership interest in animals by mortally maiming them, or so wounding them, or so ensnaring them as to render their escape a virtual impossibility. Finally, in the last couple of decades, we've moved away from a notion of animals as strict chattel or strict things or property. Anti-cruelty statutes are now in place in most states. Animal welfare rights are finally having their day in court, but we still have a long ways to go.
Diana, since the law comes from courts and legislatures, which are, after all, political bodies, how much has the center of political thought shifted in terms of how we view animals?
Well, I think that it's shifted quite a bit. And in fact, if you talk to any one of the members of the New Jersey legislature, they'll tell you that on any issue, by far, they get the most letters regarding animal issues than of any other issue there is.
Why is
children.
that? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that it's because animals provoke a very deep response in all of us that we can't quite even name. And that's because they're completely helpless, dependent on us. They can't speak for themselves. And when they are entrusted to us, they are entrusted to us wholly and completely. And I think all of us, although we can't remember it, can at least hearken back to the time in our own lives when we also occupied the same state of helplessness and dependency.
Doc, it would seem to me that this shift in the body politic would yield some criticism of folks like yourself who think there is some basis for using animals for experiments. Has it resulted in criticism or an adversary relationship?
Well, I think there has been an adversarial relationship, but I think by and large, during my career in the last 35 years, we've seen dramatic changes in the way animals are considered and the way animals are used. I don't think there's any doubt that animal research has produced a tremendous amount of benefit, and the general public knows and understands they must be continued to be used. But we're using them in far fewer numbers. We're using them in a more humane way, what we call refinements. We're replacing them with in vitro technology. But in the long term, an ultimate goal may be to eliminate the use of animals in research. But all of the benefits that the body politic want, and namely better health, longer life, a more livable life, is going to come about through a combination of the use of animals in research and in other ways.
Doc suggests to me, Paula, something that the society in some ways wants to have its cake and eat it too. I mean, we want to eat meat, but we want to kind of like Bambi, but we want to eat venison. We want to have the benefits of advanced scientific work. Are there many people who would say, for example, that if we could benefit 5 million children in the next century with experiments on 5,000 chimpanzees, where do you think, how would the body politic wrestle with that question?
I think it is such a difficult balancing act, Raymond, and there really are very passionate responses that are evoked from both sides of the issue. I hope as a civilized society, though, that we'd be able to concede that unnecessary harm, unnecessary cruelty perpetrated upon animals is wrong. It is morally wrong. It is ethically untenable.
But you've used the word unnecessary. I, for example, have had a chance to talk to some people from PETA, the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, and Diana, the position at least many of them take is no eating them, no experimentation. One criticized the leather belt I was wearing at the time of the conversation. I mean, there is a group that, or some groups that take the position that when we try to strike this balance, that animals essentially should be treated with the same level of respect as humankind.
Yeah, there are, I mean, within the animal rights and animal welfare movement, there's diverging opinions, and some are abolitionists who believe that there should be absolute abolition of all experimentation on animals, and they pose the question that we shouldn't do anything to animals that we wouldn't do to ourselves. And I remember back in law school, there was, in my jurisprudence class, there was this model set up that if we could live a completely peaceful existence as a society with no disease and no hunger and no crime, but that would depend on locking one individual in the cellar for all of its life and leaving it there alone to starve and be lonely and hungry and cold and tired, would we have the right to do that? And that's essentially the same question that comes up with animals. Do we have the right to subject them to torture, pain, humiliation, and death simply because it is cheaper and more cost-effective and easier for us to do that?
What's your answer to that question? What's your personal answer to that question? Do you think, for example, do you think there's ever a justification for experiments on animals?
Well, I don't dispute that we do benefit from experimentation on animals, and in fact, you know, there are some, like, for example, with cardiac research, there is some circumstances where you do need a living, breathing creature with a central nervous system in order to test the product on. But I think that we completely overuse animals in research. It's totally unnecessary. Much of what we do is, it's just cheaper and easier to use animals. It's habit. It's what we've been doing for a long time. It's certainly not necessary. I dispute.
Can you give us an example of what is an area where there's overuse of animals in research?
Well, for example, there's in cosmetic testing, there's still the use of what's called LD50, which means that that the industry force feeds the animal a certain product, like a caustic agent like bleach or a cosmetic, until 50% of the test subjects die. Now that's being...
Well, you know, that's a tired and true example. I would dispute much of what you've had to say in all respect, Diana. First of all, the question was asked about research, and you allude to LD50. LD50s are used, but very, very modestly. The numbers that are used of LD50s are coming down to the point where they do limit tests with a half a dozen animals.
Let me put it in
very
terms,
different today.
Since most of us haven't had a chance to study LD50s,
sure.
Let me put it in other terms.
Okay.
We can see the difference, I think, many folks, between cancer-related research and research to make a better mascara or a cosmetic product. Are there still experiments being done with respect to cosmetics and things that are not life-saving kinds of work?
I think you raise a very basic point, and I think we probably all share this. There are probably some uses of animals that as individuals we can support, and perhaps there are others that not. And everybody has to make up their own choice. I mean, some people don't want to hunt, some people don't want to eat food.
Well, but isn't it true that everybody has to make up a choice? Because we're talking about where will society have laws to prevent some uses.
Moving in that direction. Just to give you an example, I mean, quite honestly, I have been in research all my life. If I try and evaluate the value of the use of laboratory animals versus, say, the value of the use of animals for meat, look at the numbers. There are probably 5.5 billion chickens killed every year for food. There are fewer than 10 to 20 million laboratory animals used for all of the research that's been conducted. If you look at the value of those lives for research and what we get out of them,
this is an interesting argument. Paula, why isn't Doc reasonable in saying if you really want restrictions on biomedical research, you should be a vegetarian, because you have to be willing to advocate that we don't use even more animals for eating, because we could find other sources for nutrition, than this relatively small number for experiments. Why isn't that a reasoned position?
Because I think, unfortunately, that it clouds the issue and takes the emphasis away from where it belongs. It belongs upon all of us galvanizing and acting as responsible citizens to prevent the infliction of unnecessary cruelty and unnecessary pain upon animals.
But why isn't he reasonable in saying if there are 50 million, let's say, chickens that are eaten and only 500,000 that are used in experiments? I mean, let's say there's a big disparity. How can you come to me and say I should limit the number on which I perform experiments when you're eating all these others?
Because two rights ultimately don't justify the evils, and I really contest this notion of necessary evils as well. I think Diana makes a very good point that too much of this research is duplicative. The laboratories are finally starting to feel some pressure to self-regulate, but the anti-cruelty statutes have not gone far enough. For that matter, animal rights activists have often found themselves deprived of a day in court because too often the judicial system tells them that they do not have standing. If animals are perceived as...
You have to explain what you mean. That you can't come in, if you sue for me as an individual, that means that you have to have a special relationship to me in order to get into court.
Precisely.
And you're saying that for animals, it's hard for animal rights activists to get in because they don't own the particular animal?
Right. If the animal animals are perceived to be the property exclusively, for example, of the testing laboratory, then who are you as a so-called stranger to the transaction to essentially sue or try to vindicate rights? Until lately, the courts have said that that's akin to your coming into court trying to sue me to prevent me from drilling holes in my own automobile, which I own.
Diana, at this... go ahead. Please.
Okay, I would also add that, you know, we also need to talk about here about the private realm. And what we know, what's come out of the children's rights and the women's rights movement, is that the privacy is a very dangerous notion for creatures and people who are dependent upon others for their care and well-being. And I think that what the biomedical research industry has done, and I congratulate them on this, it's a public relations coup. Number one, they've made us believe that we need all the research that they do. We need all these animals for research. And two, they make us believe that somehow all these animals are being treated well. And in fact, that's not the case. If you just look at what happened last year with the Huntington Life Sciences Lab in Franklin, New Jersey, and also their laboratory in London, what was happening was that not only were these animals being treated with utmost cruelty, and I'll give you an example of what was being done in London. The techs were caught on tape doing necropsies, which is basically an autopsy on an animal, while the animal was still alive. So they had untrained technicians, which Huntington admitted to, doing experiments and all sorts of invasive procedures on animals. I mean, nobody is in that lab.
So you're saying this is more widespread than the industry is willing to admit?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, you know, just let me finish this point. You have people in these labs who are doing things to animals, and there's nobody in that lab watching them to make sure that they are abiding by the Animal Welfare Act. The only time that that there's any kind of exposure was when somebody blows the whistle. So how do we know? I mean, even if we could agree that animals should be used for research, there's no guarantees that they're being treated humanely. That's a joke.
What about the issue of control and supervision, which Diana raised?
Well, I mean, you know, to use an example like Huntington, or to use an example like the head trauma lab at the University of Pennsylvania, they're good examples, and they get a lot of mileage, but they are the exceptions rather than the rule. I mean, I have been personally into probably hundreds of laboratories in this country as part of an accrediting body and so forth, and I know the kind of care that goes into developing protocols to make them humane, to train technicians to do things properly, and these sort of abuses, while they can be cited, you could cite abuses in child abuse, in women battering, etc. That doesn't prove the case. It is not the tip of the iceberg, I would contend, because I've been there and I've seen it more than...
We don't know, though. You're not there every day, and none of us are there every day. Well, so you may do spot checks. Let me give you another analogy with animal shelters, in which I represent animal shelters throughout the state. Now, once a year, the health department in that municipality drops in and does an inspection, but what happens the other 364 days a year when no one's there to watch? We know that the private realm is a very dangerous place for people and animals who are dependent upon their caretakers. That's been proven time and again.
Paula, Doc spoke about an accrediting group, which I believe is a private body of... Right. Now, is there in society adequate resources devoted to the question of providing the kinds of protection that Diana advocates so that we wouldn't have this dispute over whether, in fact, the conditions that she describes are prevalent in wide-scale?
I don't think that there are. There need to be greater enforcement mechanisms. We certainly need a more proactive governmental monitoring, or a board of governmentally imposed overseers.
I would agree with that.
I thought Doc said he agreed with that.
No, I just testified in Washington last week that the USDA needs to include rats and mice as part of the regulated species that are used in this country. That does not say that the wholesale torture goes on with rats and mice. They're covered in other mechanisms, but the fact that they haven't been covered all the years is inexcusable, and I think they need to figure out the way to do that. 80 or 90% of the animals that are used in research in this country are rodents, and I think the tide has turned, and the scientists and the veterinarians and most of the people at this conference were in favor of getting USDA involved in controlling the rat and the mouse, as well as other animals.
I think the concept also of standing needs to be liberalized so that there's almost a private attorney general, that any one of us as private citizens would have standing to challenge what is going on behind closed doors.
I would
under the rubric of public
agree.
nuisance law, for example, a public nuisance is being perpetrated upon the greater community's moral sense when animals are treated in an unnecessarily cruel or inhumane way.
So as I stand here now, if I see an act of cruelty taking place, if I don't have some legal connection to the person or the people doing it, I don't have legal standing to raise the issue in court?
No,
that's right, and you should be entitled to. And I would use, to borrow from property concepts, public nuisance doctrine to allow you in.
We're winding down, but I want to say, what about pets? We've talked about laboratory animals. Is there need for more progress with respect to pets and abuses that happen with respect to domestic animals?
Absolutely. First first of all, I'll tell you that New Jersey is one of the only states in the country that does not have a felony cruelty statute. In fact, if you commit animal cruelty in this state, it's not even a misdemeanor. It's a disorderly persons offense, which is punishable by $250 fine or up to 6 months in jail, which, believe me, I can't even remember. I don't even know if
you think there should be
gone
felony, serious jail sentences for cruelty, and other states, in fact, have such sentences?
Oh, yes.
Paula, does it surprise you that New Jersey is in the position that it's in terms of this issue?
It's shameful, particularly since the state of the law has not caught up to the state of our scientific technology. We've learned that animals are sentient beings. They experience pain. They may even have a greater capacity to feel pain than we as humans do, because most species of animals simply do not have the cognitive capabilities to start thinking about something else or allow themselves to escape the fear and pain from enveloping their consciousness.
I'm experiencing pain because I have to bring this discussion to an end, and I would like to be able to carry it on. We'll have to come back and resume this. There's lots more to explore in this subject, but that's it for this edition of Due Process. Wow. Join us next week when our docket will include another important look at law and social justice. Till then, for all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown.
And we got in touch with an insurance company, and they really did a hands-off type thing. No, that's not us, and we're not going to pay. And then they had called and said, you know, it was very late at night. One night they had called and said, your dog is only worth a certain amount of money, so there's no use of going to court and trying to get this amount of money. We'll give you, your dog's worth maybe now $200, so we'll give you maybe $500 at the most.
And so what did you say to them?
Well, we didn't accept at all. My mother answered the phone and said, well, I'll let my daughter know about that, but I could tell you right now, it's not acceptable. And I had called back and said absolutely not. And at that point, they were very strict and stern, saying, well, if you don't take this, you're not going to get anything. That they were doing me a favor, that the dog wasn't even worth $500 at that point.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.